Welcome to Australian Slacklining Association, episode 3 of our Access Series podcast. And today we're excited to be talking to two guests, Chris Wallace from ASA and a highliner for a long time, and Neil Monteith, who knows a lot about the Grampians closures. He wrote a Grampians Guidebook. He's now based in the Blue Mountains and also had experience with negotiating access there, I guess, and working with access. So we're excited to be talking to them both. The Grampians closures was a shock, I guess, to most people. It's the largest example of losing access in a short period of time. So, and we can learn some lessons, I guess, of also what didn't go well in the follow-up to the Grampians and what did go well. So I'm really keen to talk to him. I want to start with an introduction for Chris. So Chris has been around highlining for longer than me, 5 or 6 years, at least longer than that. I remember him as someone that was always involved in working with the community, whether that be wherever gatherings I went to and things like that, or he was also involved in writing a highline fixed establishment guidelines. So, and I remember when I was reading that, it made me think about the ethics of bolting and using natural anchors where I could, and really considering, is bolting the right choice in this situation? And I've still got a box of bolts in my cupboard because after reading that, I ended up carrying span sets and ropes everywhere and rigging a lot of natural stuff. So he's always been a contributor, I see, to the community, and someone that's thoughtful about ethics and the impact we're going to have, and can we keep doing it in the future if we behave in certain ways. So I'm keen for him to be part of the conversation, and I'm also not that savvy on the Grampians closures, so I'll be asking questions from a layman's perspective. Chris is a lot more savvy than me, so he'll be asking Neil some good questions from a more savvy perspective. So regardless of your understanding of the closures, you'll get some good stuff out of the conversation. So let's dive into. I might get Chris to introduce Neil actually, and just talk about why we asked him to be on the podcast, and go from there.
Yeah, sure. So a lot of my information on the Grampians has sort of come through various sources, and Neil has contributed to a few of these as well. So, I sort of respect his sort of ability to have seen this play out in a more broader context. I've talked with a number of people in this sort of area, and as slackliners, we kind of sit on the sidelines of this issue a little bit. We're not major players by any means. We're attempting to gain access to sort of just about anywhere at the moment to really get ourselves legitimised. And the Grampians of Garryweld has had this sort of, much more broader political issue play out. And so, it's interesting to see, the perspective from someone in the climbing, world who is a lot more directly involved in, the ramifications of this. Yeah, so Neil's helped write the guidebook for, would it be the most recent edition, given the closures?
This edition, 2015, probably will be the last print guidebook in the Grampians, I suspect. Seems slightly pointless to publish anything more. I would rip the pages out of this guidebook one by one to show the crags that have been closed, but it's not quite finalised, the band's down there yet, so I haven't quite got to that stage yet. Yeah, thanks, Dan and Chris, for having me on this. There's definitely some crossovers in slacklining and climbing. I mean, one of the major things that's quite different is that you guys are starting afresh, and that's one of the hardest things with climbing. We have a history of well over 50, 60 years of climbing in somewhere like the Grampians, with a lot of the areas that have been shut, are really long, entrenched. There might be like 10 print guidebooks to some of those areas. Tens of thousands of climbers that have sort of been used to climbing in these places, sometimes for generations. There's people that live in Natamuck, that we're down to the third generation of climbers who have climbed the places like Garapiles and Grampians now. So we have this sort of effectively there's some history there, I guess, which can work against us and work for us in some ways. The advantage of you guys is you guys can start afresh with your anchor guide, for example, and ethics effectively with a clean slate, whilst we have gone through many generations of climbing from the very early days of just dodgy old ropes tied around waist to bashing in pitons to trad gear and swore climbing with bolts and bouldering emerging. We've had, every decade there's sort of a new version of climbing has emerged, which have all had, I guess, access implications as we go through. Anyway, thank you.
And no problems. And you used to guide as well? You've done guiding in the Grampians, or
no? I'm kept well clear of guiding and sort of effectively commercial things. I mean, I've always been a recreational climber. I've been climbing for 30 years this year, I think it is. 31 years, I think. Originally from Queensland, climbed a lot around there, then lived in Victoria for more than a decade, where sort of the boom time of Grampians and Rapleys climbing, and then I've now been in the Blue Mountains for 10 years. But I've been very heavily involved in, I used to run a climbing magazine called Crux in the 2000s, so very heavily involved in, I guess, photography. I used to love climbing photography and writing articles and stuff like that, sort of pre-social media, in this world where, I mean, we might touch upon this later, but in a world where you could freely publish a story about climbing or doing new routes or something in a climbing print guidebook or a magazine, and the only people that would ever see that were climbers. Like it never was accessible to someone outside of the world of climbing. So you could be a lot more, I guess, open about what was happening. You were kind of in this insular bubble of security because it was just your version of publishing. And that has obviously changed massively now with the invention of social media and just big public posts. It's so easy for a land manager to, type in the words slackline hanging rock, and they'll come up with pictures and see photos of people and be able to trace that back to the identity of that person and what group that was. And that's just not what the early days of climbing media was about. So yeah. And up in the Blue Mountains, I'm still heavily involved in doing new climbs. And since the Grampians fiasco, much more involved in access-related issues. So either lobbying governments, lobbying just land managers in general, and trying to make climbers look better, effectively. Try and make our image improve from what's been dragged through the dirt, be that work days and that sort of stuff. Yeah.
So, talk us through the scale and the suddenness of the Grampians closures, I guess, like for someone that doesn't have a clue, what the suddenness, the scale, and then the impact that it had, I guess, and the response to that. And then
the Grampians is a really big area. I used to have all these facts straight on top of my head when I used to do more media stuff about this, but it's something like 100 kilometres long and 30 kilometres wide or something like that, 40 kilometres wide, and there's somewhere in the I wish I could remember my numbers, but we're talking maybe close to 10,000 climbs and boulder problems there across hundreds of different cliffs. It's a bit like the entire of the Blue Mountains, but every one of the bits of cliffs has a road near it, so you can approach it easily. If you look at the Blue Mountains, it's much more of a singular road, or two roads through the Blue Mountains, and we can only really access quite a limited area. The Blue Mountains is a much more easily accessible for some areas, but vast wilderness, whilst the Grampians is much more, you could 2 hours walk to anywhere you want in the Grampians. Really long climbing history. As I said, some of the very first rope climbing in Australia was there. So we're talking, there's photos, really amazing photos from like the 1912s of people with ropes tied around their waist, scrambling up these amazing things. Really world-class climbing. I mean, prior to these bans, one of the reasons I published my first climbing guidebook to the Grampians was I would be climbing overseas in meccas like Yosemite and European limestone, and I'd tell overseas people about our climbs at home, and they'd never really heard about it. And I'd be like, the rock is incredible. It's the most amazing orange sandstone, beautiful place, kangaroos, bush. And they're like, I don't even know about it. I'm like, I literally went home and started writing a guidebook because I felt like it was sort of underappreciated in the world. And it really is. It's incredibly, if you've traveled around the world, it's incredibly unique, beautiful sandstone that's quite rare elsewhere in the world. So that's kind of what it was, and there was lots and lots of people climbing there every weekend. Totally international climbing destination. I mean, every world famous climber has come and climbed in the Grampians, from the Sharmas to the Honolds to the blah blahs. Everyone's been here over many decades. It was a total destination crag, and I mean, I kind of lump Grampians in with the Rapleys because the Rapleys has had similar bands. It's a similar climbing area. It's about an hour's drive from the Grampians. It's kind of a little isolated area. That's pretty much the most popular climbing area in Australia. It's also suffered similar bans. So yeah, major meccas for climbing in the world. One of the reasons the bans was somewhat of a surprise, I guess, was the majority of the Grampians seemed to just be a no man's land in a sense. You could travel and explore and go bouldering and climbing. You never ever saw anyone but climbers. It was sort of our little world that we wandered around. You sort of park on the side of a dirt road and stumble up a hill for 45 minutes. And the only people you ever saw there were climbers, and read guidebooks about climbing, and you followed climbers, and you camped in the bush there with climbers, and that was it. You very rarely saw any rangers. Like, I never saw a ranger outside of someone emptying a bin, maybe in a campground. Like, we never ever saw any rangers up in the cliffs. And we didn't really hear anything particularly bad from rangers. We did a couple of track work days there. I remember doing in the 2000s, the rangers came in and helped us build tracks to some of the climbing caves up in the more remote areas. And the key trigger point to the Grampians bands totally is everything about the Grampians and Rapleys bands is Aboriginal cultural heritage, and that was the trigger point for the whole bands. Is that there was a couple of instances where someone put some safety bolts in a cave that had some Aboriginal art in it. Archaeologists saw this, and that has effectively triggered a cavalcade of bands since then, and we're talking well over half the climbs in the Grampians, the areas, not just the climbs, the whole regions are just off limits now, including not even being able to walk there. Like the Parks Victoria, the land manager has said, walking off track is not allowed in these areas. These are, to be sealed up. There aren't tourist tracks there. That's just, 20 kilometres by 10 kilometre kind of zones, a whole bunch of them in the Grampians, which people are not supposed to go there now. And this is a lot to do with fear of potential damage. So there's never been any damage directly. There's no climber has ever damaged directly a piece of art. A bolt's never gone into a piece of art. These are all outlandish claims from the Parks Victoria early on, which are all found out to be false. But the worry is potential damage. And so Parks Victoria's and some of the Aboriginal corporations have always had this, from the various first times these bands sort of started being heard about in 2018, 2019. It's all about, look, something could have happened. A climber could have. We don't know what these climbers are doing. They're just wandering around our national park, and they could have, climbed all over that art, or they could have put a bolt in that piece of art. And really, the bands we've been hit with at such a huge slab almost overnight have all been around the potential for harm, not harm that has been actually caused. Yeah,
I'd like to think as well that climbers aren't necessarily the only user group that have been impacted in this. I mean, pretty much anyone that does use sort of the more remote areas of the Grampians has been impacted, but climbers are by far and large the major user group of the remote areas in the Grampians.
So the only other people that used them were bushwalkers. So there was quite a lot of people that would do remote bushwalking. And four-wheel drivers, but like you shouldn't knock people that are still in the same place you are. So a lot of it was just areas that I guess climbers just in their brains, including myself, just sort of assumed it was sort of inverted commas ours because we never saw anyone else there. And that has proven to not be correct. There was, you look into the records, and there was pretty decent archaeological surveys and stuff of the Grampians done in the 70s and 80s. And it's really a bit of a failure from the land managers to manage their land. that they were caught unaware. So as soon as this particular couple of incidences occurred where this archaeologist had spotted these anchors that had been freshly installed, suddenly they started looking at other places in the Grampians and discovered, there's this whole subculture called rock climbing that we kind of know about, that we've kind of just been letting happen. Oh my God, they're everywhere. And they started looking online on these lovely, online databases that record every climb in every location, and they could see immediately, they could pull out their old archaeology reports from the 70s and 80s and realise, these climbers are in the same areas. And we didn't know that because they weren't managing their land. They were effectively just sort of sealing it up and forgetting about it. So it was a bit of a failure on there. So effectively they came in almost so late that they panicked and slammed the doors shut. And they've been entirely reluctant to open any of those doors. It's effectively pretty much a done deal that most of this is just to be banned. Half the Grampians climbing, or more than half the Grampians climbing.
Yeah, it's scary to think of. I think if I go to a national park and I follow the rules, surely I'm going to be right. But in that case, climbers would follow the rules. But I guess because parks probably hadn't put in place a few rules they wish they had of, i.e., these are the artwork areas to stay away from or don't bolt in or whatever. Climbers, I guess, were caught unawares by rules that didn't exist because the land manager hadn't picked up on it yet, I guess.
Well, they were just not around and not communicating. Their locations of art sites are generally a state secret. That's how it's always been operated on, and that's to stop vandalism. It's reasonably, established pattern that, I don't know, Bogans or someone have destroyed Aboriginal artworks deliberately. So the strategy has been for about 30 or 40 years to, when that artwork panels are discovered, that they're not put on any sort of public database that people can look up. So that totally works against if your pursuit is exploration and climbing rocks, which is what climbers are doing. That strategy backfires spectacularly. But the fact that the land managers hadn't put two and two together to work this out for so long, I mean, we're talking about areas that they were suddenly very offended by and very upset by. The anchors had been there for 30 years. It's not like they were put in last week. But they had not even noticed, or even oddly, some of these areas were areas that Parks Victoria sent rangers to build tracks to, and the Victorian government used these areas in publicity campaigns for tourism, like really weird stuff. But it was suddenly they panicked effectively about the consequences of it.
Were there any negative interactions or any sort of warning signs of the Aboriginal culture sensitivity, I guess, of the area between climbers and Aboriginal culture, or between climbers and parks? Were there many warning signs in the lead up that there was?
Not any sort of long-term warnings. I remember maybe 6 months before the bans were suddenly announced, there was a bit of a warning. I remember from the Access organisation at the time, the lady who ran that, sent a bit of an email about she'd heard this story about, I think, this archaeology interaction with and these were brand new anchors that had been installed by this climber, actually not in the normal Grampians area, in another area. So this sort of a rumour had spread, and she was sort of effectively sent an email saying, hey, if anyone's out establishing new routes, just maybe, watch out, this is coming. Take extra care. We don't know what's happening, and we didn't. And then it was just surprise. And it was this sort of unbelievable thing where this ranger turned up at this. The first we really knew that the ban was coming. This particular ranger, the rogue ranger incident, as it will be forever known, turned up at this one of the absolute world-class climbing areas called Newline, this massive cave, which, as far as I'm aware, still doesn't have any Aboriginal art in it. But this ranger turned up with a bunch of international climbers there and handed out this bit of paper to them, all saying climbing was prohibited in this area. And this sort of very formal looking bit of paper with a Parks Victoria logos on top of it and sort of map, and there's something about a climbing ban. And these internationals and these couple of other people there were like, what's this? And so they sort of left the cave, and that was forwarded to some climbing access organisation who was like, "What's the story with this?" And like, we contacted Parks Victoria and said, we've just been, this piece of paper about something to do with the climbing ban over this huge area has just been handed to our members, and they were like, oh yeah, that wasn't proper there, that wasn't real, yeah, that was an accident, that wasn't supposed to be handed out. And so this ranger, this was actually draft documents for the ban that this ranger had printed out on his own and gone out single-handedly and decided to start the ban early before Parks Victoria had officially announced it. So we got this sort of bizarre warning by this rogue ranger who proceeded to start distributing the paperwork before all the media advisors at Parks Victoria had formulated their great media launch campaign. That's how it happened. It really was, and that was it. It was like, as soon as it was discovered that was a real thing, that was the warning we got.
It's an incredibly to that, it's an incredibly unique scenario for how access has changed so rapidly in an area in Australia. Yeah, I can't think of any other management body that has reacted quite as swiftly, quite as as I don't think there's bans is anywhere near as in the entire world. Yeah. And so bizarrely as well, because as we've seen as well through some freedom of information requests, Parks were planning this for some time behind the scenes, and so it sort of came around and
never mentioned
it. Yeah,
and there was a good relationship between the Climbing Access Organisation, Cliff Care, that was the Victorian Climbing Club, that was the the access, the main point of access. There was a really great relationship with the lady who ran that, who'd been there for a long time, and National Parks, and she was entirely blindsided by the whole thing. So she was regularly talked to them, organised track days, great relationship, and she was not led into this at all. She was as blindsided as everyone else when they just turned around and said, it's all over, these areas are to be shut. And, it was so sort of disorganised on Parks Victoria. They didn't really have proper maps. They had a bit of an idea about what they wanted to do, but it was, very early on. It's such a vast, complex area.
Now,
they haven't got much better, but the early ones were just kind of, it was almost like, early on it was like, what's open? Is it all shut? We don't really know. It was on such a mass scale. And then later on it just got worse and worse. The early on one, they used which, an interesting thing to know about. So Grampians had these sort of a plan of management from, I think, about 2001. I'm trying to remember all my dates now. I think it was from about 2001. And in that document had some mapped zones at the back, really bad, crappy black and white maps at the back, which had some zones, different zones in the Grampians. And some of these were like special protection zones and different sort of zones. And deep in that document, it actually, if you looked in detail, it actually said that climbing wasn't I can't remember the wording. It wasn't a prohibited activity, but it was a not preferred activity or something like that in a special protection area. But no one, when this plan of management was drawn up in 2001, noticed this either or paid much attention to it. And so most of these climbing areas, the really amazing world famous ones, were all inside these SPAs as they got to be known. And so Parks Victoria could effectively say, what we're doing, we're enforcing the ban that we put in 2001. We don't need to put anything new in. Look, the back of the 2001 plan of management, it says there's an SPA and you're not supposed to be climbing there. So piss off. We don't need to do anything. That was their method of doing it. And everyone was like, oh God, the Victorian Climbing Club, Cliff Care was involved in that plan of management in 2001. But no one had noticed or had seen that this thing was sitting in this plan of management the whole time.
And I think this is exactly what sort of most access bodies across Australia now taking a lot more care with. This is sort of probably one of the biggest takeaways we can have from the Grampians, is that people are very particular now about what does go into plan of management, because
read the fine print, read every word. Yeah.
Exactly.
Every appendium at the back, because all these plan of managements have appendiums at the back, will reference something, and right at the back will be some table and a chart and a something or other, and in there can lurk,
I guess also because the relationship you have with the land manager could change, because the land manager changes. You have a good relationship, then you don't have a good relationship.
Yeah, well, that's
one of the plan of management's there, I guess.
Yeah, well, one of the big takeaways from the Grampians was that climbers had a really good relationship with many rangers. Some of the rangers were rock climbers for decades and decades, but there was a slow attrition of rangers leaving in the Grampians region. One by one, they left and were replaced by new people. And only in a few years, just before the bans came around. And so when the bans were sort of announced, all the rangers, even the head rangers, knew little about climbing. They certainly knew nothing about the history of how long climbing had been there. They were unaware that there'd been work days building tracks to these climbing areas that they were now banning. Like, the climbers were like, but we did work days with you guys. We organised it. Here's some photos. Here's a ranger. See him in his uniform. He's got a chainsaw. He's chopping the trees down that had fallen over the track to the gallery sport climbing area. And now you're saying that was a cultural heritage site that you'd known about for 30 years and you weren't supposed to climb there? No, like here, look at this. Tourism Victoria's website. It has the gallery listed as a great destination to go to in wet weather. Like, that's literally Tourism Victoria's website. You can use the Wayback Machine to find this version of the website. I love doing that, just getting on Wayback Machine and finding, and they kind of all deny that this was all happening. But that was one of the dangers, and it's one of those things I always say about access. One of the dangers. It's nice having a relationship with a particular land manager, a personal one-to-one relationship. I get on really well with the head ranger, or I get really on well with this one. But you're at a whim. That guy just changes jobs, moves away, and the next guy that comes in can hate climbing or know nothing about climbing. And that's what definitely happened in the Grampians.
Definitely, and this is particularly pertinent, I think, to slacklining as well. So we have a lot of individual sort of one-on-one relationships across many national parks in Australia, where the rangers are happy for us to slackline. They're, happy to basically allow it to go ahead as we are doing, provided we're respectful to the environment, provided we follow all the other park rules, yada, yada, yada. But again, the devil's in the detail. We're not in the plans. So all it takes is one change of leadership, and that, relationship is worth nothing. So, exactly. We're learning from this as well. We're getting in the plans, getting it in writing.
These plans of management are key. I mean, sorry, there's a giant thunderstorm and pouring rain behind me now. I'm actually just going to turn my light on in this room because it's getting very dark as this storm approaches.
Yeah, I asked Laurie Mode that. I was like, well, why do we need to be in the plan of management? And she said exactly what you said. Otherwise, you're stuffed. Change management.
I hope the rain noise isn't too bad. One of the unfortunate things that I've noticed about plans of management that are coming through, I mean, firstly, when plans of management comes up for review, which is about every 15 to 20 years, everyone must write submissions. Personal submissions are really key. Don't just expect your access organisation to write the submission for all of slacklining. It's really important that a land manager gets hundreds and hundreds of submissions. I mean, I'm looking at this was my submission here to the Grampians one. I mean, it was a big document. I went on and on and on, ranted, picked apart all their plan. And that's, you hope you get at least a couple of dozen people that are willing to go to that level of picking apart their things. And they do all get read. I mean, they really do. Someone has to sit down there and they have to make tables and charts about these things, showing, and it's amazing really what often, if people are totally happy with something, they won't write a submission. So you're not going to find, bushwalkers won't write much of a submission when Blue Mountains National Park plan of management comes up, because whatever, they're allowed to bushwalk wherever and do whatever they want. So you might get a couple of dozen submissions from bushwalkers, but if you're triggering some ban on some activity like slacklining, it's much easier. It's probably quite likely you're going to get, like the Grampians, when the new plan of management for the Grampians came up a few years ago, like something like 80 or 90% of submissions were from rock climbers. It's because it was such a big issue, and they all had to get read, and they all had to be read out in some report. And Park Victoria was forced to, write the results of this. They could ignore them, but they had to publish them in a report saying, this is how many people said this is how many people. They tried to twist the way people had put their submissions in as much as they could. Unfortunately, these plans of management are getting smaller and with less detail. It's a bit of a new thing that land managers are doing. I've noticed this particularly in New South Wales, that it's now they're trying not to dig themselves into a hole with some long-term thing for 20 years. So they are really trying. So you'll find these new plans of managements are actually a little light on detail and allow flexibility, which maybe is good, but maybe is bad because it does allow them, there'll be phrases in there such as, national parks can prohibit access to areas at any point of time for any reason. Something like that will be sitting in that plan of management, which means that, you might say slacklining is all great and approved, but at any time, for any reason, some guy can say no. So that's pretty bad. I mean, it's one of those, when you're putting a submission in to say that line is a bad line with like more concrete, some actual process involved before something can be prohibited, like some public consultation at least, before you just prohibit something. Yeah.
Well, and I think this is where access organisations are so vital as well, is because they have the time generally to comb through these documents and really find all of the fine print and what can trip us up in the future. Individual submissions are amazing, and they're, like, as you say, incredibly important because they do all have to be read and they do all have to be logged, and they have to formulate a response basically to what the community wants. But yeah, it's obviously impossible if you don't have an organisation put together to be able to find all the detail and to be able to respond to all of these points. So, this is the job of the ASA. This is the job of all of the climbing access organisations, is essentially to A, find when these plans of management are due for renewal, and then B, comb through them.
That's key, because they just, sometimes they appear
exactly,
and they give you a month's notice. It's like being just a little note pops up somewhere and you don't even know about it, and then it's like, and then all submissions will close in a month's time, and it's open on December the 20th, and all submissions close on January the 20th. You're like, yeah, so everyone's just away on Christmas holidays. And I think it was the Grampians one was like that. I think they gave us a month or something, because I remember banging the thing out on my laptop, driving up to my parents' place in Brisbane in the car, like, oh God, I've got to get this thing done because I've only got like a week to do it.
A month is very common. And for a 15 to 20 year plan as well, it seems such a small window, really. And this is the number one question that we always ask in the meetings that we've had in the past with. So we've had a sort of courtesy meeting with some of the key players in Parks Victoria as well, just in terms to introduce ourselves as slackliners and sort of see where we stand in their view, and same with many other meetings we've had with national parks and landholders around Australia. One of the questions we ask is, how can we get notified when your plans of management are ready for renewal? And they don't have a decent answer for this. It's their answer is literally to continue to check the website for updates. There's no mailing list. There's no.
They don't want your submission. I mean,
exactly.
Like any bureaucracy, like Centrelink or something. It's designed so you can't access this service. What a surprise! They don't have a great lot of interest in getting these.
So access organisations are vital for this role.
Yeah, and having a broad bunch of people that looks at it. Someone may have a legal background, or someone may have an historical background, or a multi-sport background is really important. So you have people that go, hey, this happened to the kayakers back in 1995. Like, I remember this, having that sort of broad brushstrokes of talent to look into those things is really key, because some people pick up some things, some people pick up others. So, yeah,
and
those plans of management. Yeah, absolutely.
So, there was a lot of bad publicity following the Grampians. It seemed to be, like, climbers seem to get a lot of bad publicity on with the Grampians closures as well. I mean, what lessons come out of that we know of, or what was observed?
Look, I guess there was many different versions of media and interviews and stuff that came out. I mean, one of the key things is, be careful about what you put on social media, because it's very easy to screenshot and use that. The media will happily, they don't care about copyright. Anything that you put online is a free for all for the media to use. What I was going to say about the media, just make sure that your organisation has someone who's pretty well trained at the media, knows how to talk without making sound bites that can be used against you. Do some background work behind the scenes before, if you're doing an interview with the ABC or someone, if you know it's the ABC or the Guardian, there's a very good chance that recreational climbing is going to be targeted as a bad thing. They will always take a preference, for example, on conservation more than they will on recreation. So you'll know that that's the angle they're taking. So just be prepared for your talking points to factor in that's your market. That's their angle they'll be going in. What else can I say? What else can I say about the media? They're not necessarily a friend in any way. They're always looking for a controversy. I used to work in the media, so that's why I'm quite good at it, because I know exactly how it works. I used to work in editing. I know how to splice up things and manipulate and make something look way more controversial than it is. That's just what you do in the media. You're looking for viewership. The more it sounds bad, the greater you'll get. I mean, I even saw it, writing articles for, say, Grampians Climbing. The ones that get millions of views sound very controversial. That's how you get readership. You'll get, I got tens of thousands of people reading some of those stories, and you sort of feel guilty. You think, man, I'm like a tabloid journalist, but that's how you're getting eyes on the page. That's how I was getting people to actually pay attention to it. As soon as you start talking bureaucracy talk and tone it all down, unfortunately, no one reads it. No one will pay any attention to it. So, yeah.
And what about the sort of adversarial approach versus, I guess, working with them? Like, I certainly find Blue Mountains could be a restricted activity in the draft management plan, highlining Grampians closures. Like, I almost feel the urge to sort of lash out and go, damn those land managers, and I wish they hadn't done that. But I guess that doesn't help matters either. Like,
well, I mean, it depends on who you're targeting. If you think a politician can change the land manager's decision, maybe it is better to be lashing out. I mean, there's many different tiers you can work on with access. I mean, are you trying to get 10,000 people to write submissions? Well, you're not going to get 10,000 people writing submissions if your public statement is, oh, it's all pretty good, it's all fine, maybe think about writing a submission, or you write a headline that says slackline to be banned for 20 years, make sure you talk about it. Like, I really think that
you've read our headlines,
facts and figures and cold hard facts are. Yeah, exactly. I mean, like I think that's my tabloid world. Brain thought, but I mean, really, you've got to just throw some hard facts at people and be, this is the reality of what's happening. And the only way you're going to get anyone to act on this is if they panic and they think it's a bad thing and they need to do things. Because most people are just totally happy to plod along, and including land managers. I mean, they just want to sit on their desk and sign the new plan of management in and just move it on. They don't want to have to attend lots of meetings and stuff like that. So being slightly dramatic is, I think, reasonably good in my opinion. You'll certainly get more attention from the media if you want that. You'll definitely get more attention from politicians if they feel like it's an event that people are paying attention to. I mean, like this is, for an example, this is the Australian newspaper. I've got here, this is, front page Australian newspaper, headlines to do with the Grampians climbing. I mean, you can't buy that kind of publicity. I mean, that means, the amount of times that I've, had conversations with people who aren't climbers, but know I'm a rock climber, and they say, hey, I've read about those bands in the Grampians. That was crazy. They did that. I'm like, wow, that's like, when the broad community understands and knows about it, that's a good thing. It means that the politicians and the land managers kind of can't hide behind their own little secret decisions they're doing. They're publicly accountable. I'm a big fan of public accountability from these things, about these decisions they make to restrict activities. I mean, they need to be front and centre and explain their reasons and be willing to stand up there and say their reasons. And they'll only be forced to do that if you make them do it. If a politician says, hey, Parks Victoria, you need to write a press release about this because everyone's asking about it. You can't just do it. Oh, great, you put it in writing. Great. And then you've got it in writing there, and you can always refer to that document that they produced, making a politician say it out loud. Yep.
Yeah. Well, and I think we've tried to.
Of course, there is the other side
on a smaller scale as well with slacklining. Where for many years we tried to sort of fly under the radar and go, oh, don't look at us, we'll hide, we won't post anything, we won't say anything. And we obviously social media is the posting things is still an entirely different beast. That's not one we're solving overnight. But our attitude has changed in the same way as what you've just described, where instead of just trying to fly under the radar entirely, we're going, no, we're a legitimate user group. We're using this area in a way that's respectful to the environment, and you need to pay attention to us and to what we want to do. And so by being loud about it, by being a bit more open about it, just in the same way that you're involving the public, we're trying to involve, I guess, other outdoor user groups and indirectly sort of the public as well. But it's a long road ahead. But yeah, of course, by standing your ground is in many ways the only way to sort of legitimize access in these areas.
One of the things you made a point before, Chris, which I was going to jump on you for, you were mentioning something about those 4-wheel drivers. I mean, like, recreational users shouldn't be sort of dissing some other group effectively. I mean, I know I would do the similar thing with slacklining, and I know I've probably said it in the past. It's like, those slackliners. In some ways, I'm like, those slackliners, they're great. They're sort of taking the heat off rock climbing in the Blue Mountains. Like, it's that kind of attitude. But you're like, you shouldn't think like that. You think actually they're allies. They're all recreational users of this land, and they might not be doing exactly what you love doing, but together they're a much more powerful force than a whole bunch of groups who look, I only boulder, I don't sport climb. I'm like, oh, great. Like, the general public doesn't know the difference at all, and the politicians certainly won't, and don't get into the nitty-gritty about the details. It should be, a public right to be in these areas doing stuff, providing it's not causing environmental damage or cultural heritage damage, really. I mean, one of the things about access in general is a key takeaway that a ranger once said to me many, many years ago, which has always sort of come into my mind, is like, don't rub our noses in it, is what he said to me. And this was a sort of bit of advice he gave me, which was, it was literally, don't do something that we have to react to. And that's a lot to do with land managers are very under-resourced, national parks and councils, et cetera, they're very under-resourced. They effectively are reactive. They react to complaints from the general public or from someone else, from, say, it's the archaeologist or whatever it is. They're reactive to something that's gone wrong. So very unlikely that the first time a land manager, say, in national parks and Blue Mountains, it's very unlikely that they learnt about slacklining in their national park from a positive experience. Their first probably reaction was someone walked in the door and said, hey, these guys have set up this thing between X and Y and it's dangerous and you need to do something about it. Okay, I'll go and, I'll look on the net. Oh, God, yeah, here's that picture. It's very unlikely that these groups have come into it with a positive first experience, and we all need to be careful that we're not creating those negative experiences that become the first experience of these people. So that's just one of the, social media is one of those things that
of course,
obviously bites us in the
so
butt.
Do land managers actually search on social media if stuff's happening?
100%. So freedom of information that we did for the Grampians, they were archiving Instagram, the Crag, which is this database of climbing, screenshots, creating vast documents of names and people and places and who they were and what they were doing. That's just normal. Typical. I know Blue Mountain City Council up here, they monitor every one of the posts that sits on the Rock Climbing the Blue Mountains Facebook page. Every one of those posts, they send us messages about it. They go, hey, can you get this off? This is bad. Can you change this? That's what they send to the Australian Climbing Association. So they are 100%, all land managers, 100% monitoring these Facebook groups. There might even be a private group. You don't know everyone that's on that group. So it's very important that, I hate to say censorship, but as an admin of these groups, if something comes up that just looks horrific, just get it offline and talk to it. I mean, the classic one I do up here on the Rock Climbing the Blue Mountains is like someone will post something just stupid and I just write PM me. And, and the person will then just say, oh, yeah, and I'll like, this is why it's a really bad idea what you've done or putting this in the public, please delete. And 99.99% of the time they go, oh shit, I didn't think about that. I just thought it would be rock climbers looking at that. I'm like, yeah, like everyone's looking at this, and they'll take a screenshot of what you've just posted there, and that'll end up in some draft plan of management, and forever be known as the XYZ. So yeah, absolutely, everything that's on the internet, you should be expecting. Yeah, a land manager to read it.
Mr. A is killing. It's a lot cheaper to have one ranger trolling through social media and monitoring all of the posts and hashtags that come out than 400 rangers having to go to all of these random remote areas all over the park and see what's actually happening. We post it all online for free. Of course they're going to look at it. You know, that's the best way to understand what's happening in their areas.
I mean, Mount Warning, to go to the extreme level. So Mount Warning, the big mountain up near Byron Bay, it's been closed for the last couple of years, and people who have posted social media pictures of them being on the summit, so breaking the ban, have been had to have formal interviews with with legal implications with lawyers and stuff like that. So they are using the social media photos from Facebook and effectively attempting to charge them on this, dragging them in for formal interviews and getting the police involved. So it's like, put a picture online. You can say it's. I mean, I don't know if slackliners do the same, but wasn't the base jumpers always refer to like jumping in Blue Mountains as jumping in Switzerland or something? But like it's that tagging, not tagging the exact locations of where everything is. Yeah. Anyway. Yeah. Yeah, everything you do, someone's reading it, and we'll be out.
So maybe once if we're in the draft, if we're in the management plan, and it was as per the rules in the management plan, it wouldn't be so bad. But I guess if you're in that limbo where you're not in the management plan, then it's especially dodgy, is it?
Yeah, well, you won't see this. These documents that are being made behind the scenes. They're not going to end up in the plan of management, but it will be part of what crafts the plan of management. That'll be part of the research documents that, for example, the archaeologist in the Grampians, this particular guy, he did things like took social media stuff, not only put it in background research documents, he did presentations to archaeology conferences using these images, so he's standing there in front of a bunch of Australian and world experts in archaeology and, scrolling through his little PowerPoint presentation, and here's a picture of a climber doing this, here's a picture of a climber doing that, So, that's the level they can end up with. They can literally end up in academic papers, forever tainting the activity. Absolutely.
It's a difficult one, though, of course, because some social media is positive. Like, it does help sort of, at least with slacklining, where, and same with climbing, as you're well aware, that, social media can be used for the advantage of trying to create a good image, a good brand. And so, like, there is benefit to good posts, but trying to define what is a good social media post and what is a bad social media post is really interesting. I sort of dived into it with a few other people at the ASA, and we've kind of come up with a bit of a framework, but again, it's incredibly hard to nail down exactly what is positive and what is negative for the sport. But mostly it sort of revolves around short attention grabbing for the views sort of thing is not necessarily a positive for our sport, especially if you're intending to reach a huge audience with a very small amount of content. But longer form content.
Well, if you want the views, you'll do something controversial. Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, it revolves around like what we're putting out there. It can be positive, and but it's just mostly thinking about who could potentially see it, and what we're trying to say with it. Is posting
absolutely.
this
I mean, that's what. Just before you hit that click, just go.
Positive and negative.
Yeah. Is this a good thing for the entire community, or is it just good so I get lots of views? That's what I would look at it. Is it going to, we'll just look at it outside of your little user group bubble, and that's the hardest thing to do. Is we all get so psyched about what we're doing. We're just like, oh, this is the best thing ever. I just had the greatest trip here. I did the greatest thing. It's like awesome. I want to tell all my friends about it. I'm like, yeah, okay. But is there something about that that's going to cause problems? Yes. Okay, let's not post it then.
So what sort of things would cause problems? What sort of things would be good for the community?
I mean, I would just, like when it comes to, things like, I guess, damage to plants, camping in places you shouldn't be camping. That's a great one. I see everyone loves now putting their little, pictures of their tent in some obscure place. I climbed the top of this pillar and I put my tent up here or something, and that kind of stuff. I mean, putting anything to do with areas that are not supposed to be there is just a terrible idea. If it's something like Hanging Rock or something, it's probably not doing anyone any favours if there's pictures sitting all over especially with all the current stuff.
I think
groups,
the best example I've seen on this topic is in Tasmania, Parks and Wildlife are okay with people climbing at, I'm going to mention it here on this podcast because this information is sort of freely available on the internet, but, the Tyndalls, so it's a sort of remote area in Tasmania, and Parks Tasmania has said we're okay with people going out there and climbing, but just stick to these sort of rules. And one of their rules is don't post anything on social media, and don't, walk on one track, and don't make it a really obviously easily accessible area. They said, look, we're okay. We're going to officially allow it as long as you can keep it as this wilderness area, and so they've sort of put the onus on us to maintain this this sort of difficulty. This we're not turning it into some social sensation. We're not creating a track to get out there and giving everyone directions and making it really, really easy. And so maybe that helps answer with what is okay and what isn't. In some areas,
locations
will make it easier for us.
I only just learned tonight in a previous phone call I had about something else. I learned tonight that Blue Mountain City Council really, really doesn't want any new climbing areas in their land listed publicly. Effectively, they really don't want. Like the idea of a new climbing area, they not necessarily have a massive issue with, but they don't want it to be put on the internet and listed as a new place to visit. So again, it's a very similar kind of thing that you're describing. It's like we're actually okay with you being there doing stuff, just don't turn it into a circus of people turning up there. I'm seeing that just with walkers around the Blue Mountains. There's a real change in the last 5 years because of geotagging everything, things like all trails, which I love, but oh man, it's not good. I mean, it's sending people, walkers, or I don't even call them walkers, people who've escaped from Western Sydney nightclubs, who are deciding to stumble off into the wilderness because they've found an all trails map that sends them to an entrance of a canyon or something, and they're off wandering down there in a pair of thongs and a singlet and a six-pack in their hand. Because it's and we're seeing it on climbing approach tracks now because they're sort of logged on things and they're visible. If you zoom in on Google Maps, you can see these things marked, and suddenly you get people turning up at climbing areas that aren't climbing; they're just walking in along the track, which can sometimes be quite a dicey proposition because it's a climber's track, not a walking track. And it's like, oh yeah, so we're seeing that a lot. Slackline would be a very similar thing, just because you have to appreciate that. You take if you publish a picture of you slacklining somewhere on an amazing pillar with an amazing waterfall, the person who sees that won't just be a slackliner who wants to go there and slackliner. It could be someone who just goes, I want to see that waterfall. I want to pose in my G-string at the bottom of that waterfall. But they saw the picture of the waterfall on the slacklining thing. And so, your implications of posting social media can go well outside your own activity, especially if it's a really delicate sort of ecosystem or something. Like, do you want a whole bunch of Western Sydney nightclubbers with white shoes walking through the mud, to get to some canyon environment?
And Matt, could I remind you that all outdoor user groups are equally valid, and we're all in this together,
including the Western Sydney Nightclub Bushwalking Club. Yeah.
They're going to be the ones joining our access group soon.
Yeah, they will.
I mean, it must be hard for land managers because once upon a time they published a brochure and it said where to go to. Like they kind of designated with their brochure where to go to. Now there's people publishing guidebooks all the time. I see them all the time. They're selling sort of the best 10 places to visit on social media or whatever. And so, yeah, people in thongs and just out of the nightclub, like they can go straight there with no...
clue. I mean, they literally... I mean, I've had people sitting at the bottom of, like, Porter's Pass climbing area, stumbling around with their white shoes, and they come up to you, as a climber there, and they come up with their phone, and they've just got a Instagram, and they just point to this, like, picture of a waterfall, like, where's this? Where's this? And they're like, oh, I guess it's down there and a kilometre and up that gully, but like that's the extent of their research. They're sort of just stumbling around on random climbing tracks with a picture of a waterfall on their phone, asking anyone they can find how to get to this waterfall.
Dehydrated and having not slept the night before. And
I mean, one of the interesting words that has only really come into vogue in a couple of times, a couple of land managers I've spoken to recently, is there's a new word that they're throwing around, which is demarketing areas. And and it's one of these things that all us recreational users need to be aware of, that these national parks and council areas are actively now shutting areas to reduce having to manage areas effectively. That's what some of the Grampians bans is a lot to do with, because they don't have the resources to go to check that the climbers are doing the right thing in the cave. So for them, it's simpler just to put a big line around something, say no entry, and then remove all signage, remove references to it on maps, remove it from their brochures. And you're seeing it everywhere now, where there's a whole bunch of walks in the Blue Mountains which have just quietly been erased. You go to the bottom of Govet's Leap there was once this walk that went underneath Horseshoe Falls and through the forest down there. It's like going to the Roman ruins. There's still like these awesome 1980s signs there and stuff and old stonework, but they've just quietly I mean, their national park strategy, you see it in the Blue Mountains, that is to funnel the tourists down a couple of set tracks. It's the Grand Canyon, go to Three Sisters. That's kind of it, really. That's where they want people to go, and everything else is don't mention it. And you're seeing that real consolidation.
Parks and Wildlife,
they just
able to manage these huge areas with an ever increasing number of people. I mean, this wasn't so much an issue for them, I imagine, at least in the 90s and early 2000s. But the advent of social media has changed things a lot for them, and I don't know if they're particularly, I guess like they don't have many options available to them to be able to manage this with. But I have to sort of think they're taking a funny strategy sometimes when you look at, or you talk to the people actually managing these parks, and then you look at what the social medias for national parks post, which is always like, oh, visit this place, come out here, get more people, and then the actual people having to deal with these people turning up. It's a totally at end to what their social media is saying. It's really strange.
The other thing that national parks does in the way it markets and does things is very different to us as recreational users. They're very much about a single use visit to these areas. So, the way national parks sets up, I'll use the Blue Mountains again, but even the Grampians, it's the same thing, is their main push is to make a couple of activities that will take a couple of tourists a few days to complete, and that's it. And they never come back here again. They've come to the Blue Mountains once in their life. They do the 3 walks that, I've ticked off the Three Sisters, I've done the Grand Canyon, blah, 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 that's it. Whilst recreational users, climbers, slackliners, we have this very unique relationship with these areas that we come every weekend. We might camp in these places for weeks on end, like for weeks and weeks. We know the ins and outs of these areas sometimes much better than the land managers themselves. The Grampians, case in point, climbers were going up and exploring all sorts of crazy areas that no land manager had been in for decades and decades. And slackliners would be totally, and highliners would be absolutely, sorry, I'll keep using the word slackliners, but it's not highliners.
No, it's the same thing.
All encompassing. But we go to places that the land managers don't go, because we're looking for these kind of locations which are not where the tourists go. That's kind of the appeal for us, is to go to to places where people haven't been, to some sort of ridiculous promontory that juts out, and I'm looking for cliffs.
Many times
some
that's
sort
the
of
advice
wild
from
place.
national parks themselves is to get off the beaten track, to get out of the way. If we can't see you, we don't mind. Which is funny when they say,
exactly.
"Oh, keep to the walking tracks though. Don't leave the established trails, but get out of the way."
So quite often they just don't. Yeah, go for it.
I was going to say people do have an impact, like the Neil Monteith from the Queensland Climbing Federation was saying how one of the crags there, like it's subsided a metre.
I'm Neil Monteith. The other guy.
Subsided a metre over something. Well, you have to listen to episode 1. Subsided a metre over time at one of the crags because people are there. So Parks Victoria, I'm guessing, looking after the environment probably sits higher than allowing a user group to have their fun. So they're trying to let us have our fun, but more important than that, in probably the job they're being given, is to make sure that the environment's looked after, I guess.
I mean, erosion is an interesting one. I actually wouldn't call erosion is actually not generally their trigger point. They're actually quite. I found land managers quite lax about erosion. You sort of have to force them to deal with tracks that are eroding. I mean, their main issue is usually vulnerable species. I mean, that vulnerable species, Aboriginal cultural heritage. That's the two things that are their trigger points. So as climbers, being on cliffs that may have, some sort of endangered plant, animal near it, that's a trigger point for them to kind of freak out. And obviously, anywhere near Aboriginal art, etc., is also a trigger point for them to instantly freak out. It's interesting. They are generally fairly conciliatory, I would think, on use. I mean, I see it in the Blue Mountains and canyons and tracks, and they'll eventually get around to actually fixing them up, and they've done amazing. I'm actually amazed at the Blue Mountains National Parks in the last couple of years since the fires. They've obviously got all this funding, and they've been building these super highways into canyons, which historically were just as off track as rock climbing areas, but for some reason canyons are now on this sort of tier upwards, and they're now building formal tracks to the entrances to a lot of these canyons. When you go to Wollongabby, I did Colostral Canyon the other day, I'm like, oh, there's like wooden steps, costing hundreds of thousands of dollars, have been installed by national parks all the way down to the start of Colostral now. So it's really interesting that they can be actually quite proactive about fixing erosion for user groups. Don't know what canyons have done right to get such silver service, but they don't go anywhere near. They almost don't even acknowledge the climbing in the national parks in the Blue Mountains up here. But canyoners get these big fancy signs with all explaining how to behave well when you're canyoning, and great positive photos, and canyoning's there's something. The canyoning Big Canyon lobby group, they're pretty good at it, whatever they've managed to achieve.
I think they're similar enough to bushwalking that they're able to ride in on that a little bit. And I mean, we're sort of trying to do a similar thing, to be honest, as slackliners, where we're trying to ride in on the other user groups as well. We go, oh, well, look, we're just the same as them. But then as soon as, they're doing something wrong, we go, oh, no, but we're different in this way.
Exactly.
Do they care much about safety, land managers? Like, what do they? You sound like you talk to them a bit, Neil. I mean, what do they care about? Care about?
I don't think the safety of the individual participants, I don't think that's particularly high on their list. They would be worried about the actions of someone affecting walkers, for example. So the classic one is someone doing an activity above a tourist track. That would be a big no-no, something you'd want to be very careful about. So putting anyone in danger, and I've talked to Chris about it in the past, but I think about highlines and aircraft or drones or something like that. It's that kind of stuff that they would be more concerned about. I don't think they have a great, most of the time your rangers are people who are bushwalkers and canyoners and climbers, and that's sort of why they're there. They enjoy doing stuff in the bush, and they see, the main accidents that happen are people tripping over and breaking ankles bushwalking. That just happens every weekend, and they're not turning around about to ban bushwalking. I don't think we should be particularly concerned about the safety. And look, really, the statistics are pretty decent. I mean, we don't we don't kill lots of people or horrifically injure people. I mean, we do have to be a bit careful about rescues for injuries and people being, I guess, calling out for unnecessary rescues. We're definitely seeing that in the climbing world, where people who are just kind of unprepared and they're like, oh, I might have to spend a night out in the cold. Ooh, I better call the toll helicopter. And like, you've got food. Like, it's summer. You just sit on the ground and, wait till the morning. You're not injured. Like, so there has to be that bit of a thought from recreational users not to take away emergency services for genuine emergencies. I mean, a helicopter rescue should be called in for someone who is injured enough that they require immediate medical. Like, if you sprain your ankle, how about you try and get your mates to carry you out before you press the button that pulls a helicopter away from Western Sydney, dealing with a horrific car accident or a shooting or something. Like, really, those resources are very limited, and we're very lucky to have them in Australia. But yeah, that's the stuff that I think would be a flag for a land manager if they start getting call-outs for search and rescue, medical fix-ups. Yeah, we definitely want to be careful about that kind of stuff, which is our personal safety. So we do have to think about, what are we doing with our personal safety? We do like doing things that are classed as semi-risky. I mean, they're highly skilled, but there is an element of risk. But yeah, think about it.
Yeah, does that the safety of other user groups, does that has that popped up in your guys' consideration down in Sydney? I guess, Chris, I know there's an area up here where I've seen a rock go off a cliff and it's not by someone there, and it wasn't right where the walking track was below, but it was close enough to be, for me, like, we've got to be clear of that place, because we have one near miss with a bushwalker. We'll be out of this park forever. Like, definitely a high risk thing I see.
There are certain national park in the plan of management for Blue Mountains National Park. There are certain areas that are defined as no rock climbing. So Wentworth Falls, the walks track around there, and under Govetts Leap, and that's purely because there's that major tourist areas, and that's no climbers have ever thought about climbing there. I think it's a pretty sensible, that they seem pretty conservative, actually. I'm actually surprised at the places they still do allow climbing at. What about you, Chris?
No, yeah, 100%. I mean, we have a bit of a responsibility ourselves as a community to pick locations that are sensible to do our activities in, because, we're the ones who were impacted by other people coming in to tell us that we can't do them there. Because, yeah, if we don't pick the right places, other people will come in to tell us that we can't do them there. Most of the time, we're pretty lucky, though, that we are highlining above, sort of areas that no one's going to access anyway, be it the sea cliffs over the ocean, or big sort of luscious fern gullies that there's just no reasonable person is going to be scrambling around in anyway, except for maybe Neil looking for a new route. But what's it called? Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, there's a number of spots out there that would make amazing highline locations, but there's a reason they haven't been highlined yet, and I think that's fair and acceptable. And same goes with the environmental considerations. I think it's reasonable that we don't have to highline or climb everywhere in the world. There are a lot of great places we can, and I think it's reasonable for us to step back and self-manage and basically say these areas don't need us in them at the moment because we are creating too much of an impact.
How do we communicate them? I mean, if climbing had any success, I mean, in terms of be aware of the culturally inappropriate areas not to do, the ones that are high risk to other user groups not to do, the ones that have environmental impact not to do, like, how do we do that? I mean, have we seen that work?
Yeah, I've had that struggle myself in how you make the online databases. Do you mark a section of cliff as a crag and then write, don't climb here? Or do you, there's this whole demarketing kind of exercise, sort of banned climbing areas. Do you erase them from the internet? Or is it better that they exist on the internet and it says that you shouldn't be there? Like, I actually don't know what the secret is, because invariably you'll get someone in a future generation rediscovering a place that someone has already been to once before and decided this was a terrible idea, but they don't know that because there's no reference to it anymore. It's a bit like the Aboriginal art. It's the same thing. Like, if you don't know there's something bad there, then it just appears like you've discovered a new place and it's all great and off I go.
It's a very fair point. Yeah, we haven't had to deal with it too much as slackliners because our community is small enough that we are able to sort of self-manage much easier and react a lot faster. But yeah, this is, I'm sure in the early 2000s, climbing was much the same where, you sort of know everyone who's doing everything. And, if someone's sort of developing in an area where they, the community sort of doesn't feel like that's appropriate, they're very quickly sort of talked to, and that is sort of amended. Whereas, like that's an issue climbing is dealing with enormously nowadays. With that, I've seen it heaps of times. New areas pop up on the internet, and very quickly those are deleted, and you can only help but think someone has had a quick chat to them and sorted that one out. Which, it's a tricky one. I'm not sure how to solve that problem.
The other access safety issue that Chris has had to deal with as well is this sort of a two-pronged thing, but obviously doing stuff around tourist lookouts, which encourages people to jump the fence to go and see what you're doing, is something the land managers freak out about, and that's a highlining thing. Commonly in the old days, the obvious thing to set up was the easy stuff was the lookout, but there's this lookout and that lookout, but obviously that's really freaks out, and I've had discussions with Blue Mountain City Council. They really don't want climbing areas below a lookout. That's a pretty default one because of that
why don't
appeal
they like that?
of like,
sorry, just repeat that.
Well, because the tourists who are sitting behind a handrail are then tempted to jump over the handrail to see what you're doing, to have some interaction with you. You might be in a harness roped in doing stuff, but you just being there on the other side of the fence effectively says to these tourists, there's something good on the other side of the fence, so they'll jump the fence, they'll crawl right to the edge, they'll lean over their head to see what you're doing over the edge. And obviously they the Council of National Parks is like, we're trying to, we built this big lookout fence to stop people from doing that. So that's definitely a trigger point. And the other one that Chris has come across, and I haven't had it directly, but Chris has seen it, is the suicide thing, these unnecessary call-outs. So Sydney Sea Cliffs has this problem. And then look, I've really only ever really heard about it at Sydney Sea Cliffs, but I'm sure it's happened in other places. Members of the public ringing the police thinking that someone's about to jump off a cliff for suicide when they're actually just a recreation. Like, okay, two guys with a helmet on and harnesses. Do they look like they're about to jump off the cliff? But this regularly happens in Sydney. Numerous times a year, the full police get called out to engage a suicide attempt, which turns out to be two climbers on the cliffs in Sydney. Chris could talk about that.
Well, yeah, amazingly, I think the statistics are actually sort of semi in our favour here. I know of one case where someone thinking of jumping was actually talked back from the cliff by slackliners. But yet I know of no cases of slackliners or climbers actually being the suicider that was called on the phone, alerted to the police about. So if anything, we're in the positive here.
But that would be a great example of a user group triggering causing unnecessary angst to the land manager. The land manager's like, you rock climbers, like, I know you're not doing the wrong thing, but we're getting these constant phone calls and the police resources have been taken out. So some of these really high profile areas just may not be suitable for these activities because it just causes an unnecessary amount of paperwork.
It's a double-edged sword though as well, because you take the recreational user group out of these areas and then rates of suicide might increase because there are fewer people around to sort of effectively, sort of police these areas and engage the community. And so this is happened in the Grampians with graffiti. So
absolutely.
This is the example of
a healthy user group that respects the environment, and then just replace it with the general public who's only visiting there once from Western Sydney with their white shoes and a can of spray paint. And I'm seeing it around the Blue Mountains. Quite a lot of graffiti is like proper tagging is starting to occur at places that never used to be tagged. And that's the kind of stuff you'll get once you don't have a regular user group using this area. If there's no one there, if a bunch of climbers was on the cliff climbing, it's unlikely that Joe Blow in the spray can would feel comfortable walking up and starting to tag the cliff. But remove the recreational users and it just turns into a canvas for whoever wants to trash the place. So I think that's definitely a legitimate. I've definitely put that in my submissions with some of these things, that the climbers really are the eyes and ears of these places. Quite often, animals and plants have been reported. Vulnerable, endangered stuff has been reported to national parks, has been discovered, and Aboriginal art has been discovered by climbers in these areas that would have never been
Lord
found
Howe
by.
Island stick insect is a prime example.
So we're not all bad.
Yeah.
Sometimes. Yeah.
Did you discover that recently, Chris? Is that part of the story or not?
No, I didn't discover that. It's I guess Sorry, I thought it was more well known about, but the Ball's Pyramid Lord Howe Phasmid stick insect. Yeah, climbers discovered this, thought to be endangered stick insect.
No, extinct.
On a remote
It was
stack.
fully extinct.
Well, it was extinct, until they rediscovered it. And then since then, climbers have been banned from that area for their discovery.
It's tough, isn't it? Like, you go there and you report this thing for the good of everything, and you get slapped with a ban.
Except Dick Smith will pay your fine if you get fined, wasn't it? I remember Dick Smith doing some lecture.
I won't put that in writing, though. You've got to.
Crikey. So what about bolting? Like, how do land managers sit on that in your experience talking to them?
I know nothing about what you're talking about. I mean, that's it's an area that land managers don't really want to know about. Definitely should not be discussed on social media or anything like that. I mean, climbing has an issue with legacy. We have bolts from 40, 50 years ago that are needing to be replaced. They are being replaced slowly by the climbing community, just behind the scenes, in a quiet kind of way. It'd be incredibly hard for a land manager to take control of these. I mean, I've heard sort of crazy stories about a couple of times that land managers have had to finance and install anchors for commercial, and it's thousands of dollars per anchor they get, because an engineer has to come in and sort of test the rock and test it and then put the anchors in and da. Like there's I think Grand Canyon's wrap chain, there's a chain that's put in for the commercial groups there, and the same as Empress, and can't remember the figure, but it was thousands and thousands of dollars, perhaps $10,000 or something, to install that single chain to abseil off. So it's something that a land manager doesn't want to be involved in managing the installation. We have seen in the last couple of months, Parks Victoria in the Grampians pay people to remove anchors. So that's a thing that's coming. That's probably the first time I've really seen that occur in Australia. I was quite surprised that they went ahead with it. There had been previous threats in Queensland for the ranges up at Flinders Peak, actually, about 15 years ago. They told some climbers that they had to remove all the anchors that they put in at this particular crag.
What happened at Centennial Arch? Was that not a case as well?
That was not formally. That was not formally removed. No, that was a weird. That's a weird. Yeah, they were kind of hacked off and badly patched by. I think some of them might have been employees of national parks, but they weren't doing it as employees. They were sort of like doing it on their own back, and it was all a bit messy. But the Flinders Peak one in Brisbane, the national parks told the climbers they had to remove the anchors, and then when the climbers sort of explained to the rangers what they would actually involve and would they be insured by national parks when they did this activity, that national parks quickly turned around and said, actually, no, we can't actually force you to do that, can we? Because then we'd take on the liability of the works. So, yeah, it's interesting. So the Grampians one, Millennium Caves was debolted a couple of months ago, quite controversially, and that's the first time at a massive expense. I imagine that project would have been at least $100,000 to remove, I don't know, less than 100 anchors, in a cave in the Grampians. So it would be very hard to roll that out across the entire the Grampians. But look, I anchors are something I've been quite heavily involved in over the years, and I've climbing has gone through different phases of being a cheapskate. In the old days, everyone financed, the installation of their own bolts. Climbing uses a lot more anchors than any highline ever would. A typical climb might have 10, 15 bolts in it. So pretty easy for the dollars to add up. So a lot of it was done really on the cheap, using cheap glue, non-stainless anchors that are all sort of pretty bad. And there's definitely been a change in the recent years to future-proof anchors and to make them more of an industry standard. And I think it's very important that is done like that, so that when a national parks or someone does question what's happening, like what climbers are installing, climbers can turn around and say, look, we're installing the best, the best quality anchors. Like these things, the glue will last 100 years, the bolts are stainless steel, they're commercially manufactured. So at least it gives us some sort of, it gives them some relief that maybe there's not a whole bunch of death traps being installed. But I think it would be very hard for them to turn around and decide they're going to.
But I think this is a major difference between climbing and highlining here is that, climbing does use more fixed anchors by and large, but the locations of them are really well concealed from the general public. And so even though we use, now the standard is really just 2 or 3 bolts either side of the cliff. And it's, by all accounts, 4 to 6 bolts per line, or even less if we're using natural on one side, or even, mostly natural and just 1 bolt extra for a bit of stability or something. By and large, we're using hardly any bolts, but they're still in incredibly visible places. So it makes it a really interesting discussion with land managers as well, where it's the first thing, in many cases, it's why they even notice that we're even there, because they notice the bolts turn up, and then they may see the highline being rigged months down the track. But it does make us an incredibly visible user group, and so by that, we've been able to adapt to a much more natural standard of rigging, much easier, much earlier on as well. Like it's definitely been sort of a core ethic of the community for a long time now, and I hope to see that continue, because I think it helps us, enormously in gaining access to be able to practice our sport.
Like I've seen a big difference in, I don't know when it was, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, when highlining really sprung into existence in the Blue Mountains in a big way. I saw anchors going in everywhere, and often it was sort of 5 bolts and sort of big obvious things sitting next to lookouts. And I've seen a really noticeable difference with the slacklining community has really, I think there's, Chris, you were involved in making documents about, how to do this better effectively, and I've seen a real noticeable difference in not seeing these huge clusters of really obvious stuff. So you guys are doing so much better at sort of hiding it from public view and reducing the anchors, and it's been really good. I think that's I've been spending a fair bit of time camouflaging some of the climbing bolts anywhere that there would be chances that members of the public might walk by. So there's definitely some climbing areas in the Blue Mountains which are near walking tracks, and so just trying to reduce the visual impact of these things.
How do you camouflage them? Just paint them or hide them?
Yeah, etch primer. It doesn't last forever, but it'll last. Like some of the ones I've had on test are sitting there 3 or 4 years. Fine. Yeah.
On the sea
And
cliffs,
you guys don't
incredibly,
even. You guys are so.
Disappeared in about 6 months. Not even.
Well,
it's amazing because, especially,
the good thing
I've tried to
about
camouflage
you
a
guys
few bolts here and there at Point Perpendicular and around some of the other sort of Sydney crags. And 6 months at most, the paint will last for, and then the bright red Hilti glue is back.
Yeah, I think anything to do with placing bolts, we really should think about how other users would see these, how other members of the public would see them. So make some effort to camouflage them, put them in locations that aren't so obvious. To be shown that you're making an effort, I think, is really important for land managers, to make them realise that you're not just thinking about your own little world, that you acknowledge the existence of other people using the areas and are making an effort to reduce your impact on those other people. I think it's a pretty key thing to do with access in general. I think really if your activity doesn't annoy anyone else, then it's pretty much will fly under the radar. Really, if no one's complaining, it's not damaging anything. Yeah, you've done very well for yourself, and really, no one will care that much.
100%. I couldn't agree more.
What sort of things do other user groups complain about?
Oh, look, I'll put my own hat on the slacklining game. I mean, the party, the larger groups, maybe not even parties, I guess they could be parties, but larger groups, definitely. That came out of nowhere from a rock climber, just not a thing that rock climbers have done and bushwalkers did. So it was very noticeable up here in the Blue Mountains, the large gatherings that used to happen. So that was something that there's a lot, the Blue Mountains especially, there's a lot of doddery old residents and retirees and...
Yeah, it's funny that you say used to happen, because they definitely still happen, but maybe we're getting better at hiding them.
Yeah, more appropriate places. Yeah, probably. Yeah, so they were quite early on. They were done in places where suburban residents, just could see and hear it happening, obviously. And so, I mean, a lot of those residents. I mean, I'm one of them in the Blue Mountains. You know, our concerns are with things like that is like fire risk. Like you go down there and there's a whole bunch of bonfires going. We're like, oh god, like fires is like the number one fear of land managers as well. You know. Any national parks person freaks with anyone running a fire. Obviously, just toilet waste and that kind of noise. You know, music and noise always pisses off most people in the bush. I think no one has this type of music that you listen to is not going to be the type of music that the next person walking past likes, and you'll never make anyone happy with music. I just remember hearing I never actually even heard them myself, but I used to hear these stories about the buzzing highlines that were left up, you know, and the residents complaining about the things buzzing all night long. I remember hearing, I don't live in Mount Victoria, but I remember hearing people complaining about those. So that's like an examples of, I guess...
We're talking about wind noise there.
Yeah, wind noise vibrating on the thing, yeah. So that's examples, I guess, of just people noticing you guys operating from far away. You know, they didn't even have to walk down to stand right next to you. They knew you were doing things, and they could hear it from, you know, half a kilometre away, which is a bad sign probably. So it's that kind of stuff, trying to keep a low profile. I mean, I think big groups. I mean, there are limits especially in national parks, on group limits. I think it's eight people that for recreational activities, that national parks doesn't want more than 8 people in a group. So I mean, we've been telling the Australian Climbing Association's been really trying to get that into the heads of we have university groups coming here. Sometimes they can be 40 people, and they're pretty clueless sometimes, and they'll be there. Oh yeah, we're just going to send 40 people to this one crag in the Blue Mountains. Like, please don't. Like, you're going to actually piss off actual other rock climbers as well. It's not just annoying the walkers, but you're actually even going to be pissing off your own group with that amount of things. I mean, car parking is another big one up in the Blue Mountains that we get. Is a lot of cars parked on residential streets now, getting more and more, and that's a mixture of walkers, climbers, highliners, etc., etc. But it's just the usual thing. Too many people in the world. We just have a lot of people in these areas that we didn't before, and the facilities for those people aren't necessarily there. Like, there's not really public toilets in most of the climbing places in the Blue Mountains. So there's only a couple that have toilets. Very limited car parking. Council has no money to produce new toilets or make more car parking. That's where I heard the phrase from them, demarketing areas, because that was their strategy. Like, this is all we can do. All we can do is start removing some of these areas from signs and things, and we don't have money to make new car parks or new toilets. So, yeah.
I've got to swap from my computer to my phone now as well, if we're going to keep going, just because my computer's about to run out of battery. Just as a heads up.
So what else do we want to talk about? I mean, I guess what have we missed? We can talk about Grampians. Are we going to get any of those areas back? Are they gone forever?
Yeah, long term on some of these things. I am not totally optimistic, I have to say. I think we're when it comes to Aboriginal cultural heritage, I think we're in a particular moment of history where that is a thing. We're seeing it probably in the Grampians is probably, I find, generally in Victoria, is a bit ahead of the game on this kind of stuff than the rest of Australia. So it's a sort of a bit of an early warning shot over the rest of Australia. I think you'll see more of this kind of stuff happening in probably New South Wales next. Queensland maybe, as usual, 5 years behind New South Wales. But yeah, so I think this is sort of effectively a political wave. A lot of decisions being made by people in cities, probably with little knowledge about how recreational users use these areas. And a definitely change in the way public land is managed in Australia. I think myself even just thought that a national park was a national park forever, and how it's managed with a piece of public land, and there was a person from the public service that was called a national parks ranger, and you could be a ranger, I could be a ranger. If we decided to get the qualifications, we could all just become a ranger in a national park, and that's kind of how they operated. I think that we need to start thinking that that's not the future of national parks. I think we're much more likely that these national parks are going to be given to some of these traditional owner corporations and to be run not as businesses, but to be much more of an Aboriginal run areas that may have much stricter limitations on them to access than we would have thought of previously. And I think that's kind of where the world is going. And recreational users kind of going to get dragged through this, probably with not much thought about us. I think I don't think we're really front and centre. And one of the reasons the Grampian stuff has been dragging on for so long is the sort of these promises of assessments to be done at particular climbing areas, and we'll assess to see if it's actually okay to climb there, and if it's okay, that maybe we'll let you in there again. But there's no benefits to any of these traditional owner groups for climbers to be there. Like, why do they, like, what's in it for them for us to be there, and they have to manage us? And so I look at it, it's a very pessimistic way sometimes to look at this, but really, how do you make it so it's beneficial to them for us to be there? And the only thing you can really think of is that how do we help the world of these areas in a much bigger picture thing, and that is doing things like weeding days or track work days, or something that sort of benefits the community in a larger way outside of your specific sport. That you should be seen as reporting an endangered, doing some animal surveys or whatever it is. There's climbers doing surveys at Kapiti National Park on particular skinks, for example, so they'll take some time out from their climbing trips up there, and they'll spend a day going around doing some surveys on some critically endangered reptiles, and then they give that information to the land managers, and they go, "Oh, thanks, great. That would have cost us money." Like, if it's like, it's a financial transaction, and that's a lot of the track work that gets done up in the Blue Mountains through the council. It's shared use walkways with walkers and climbers. And, you could put a dollar value on the meters that free volunteers are doing to build these tracks. So if you've got, 10 climbing volunteers who are spending a whole day moving rocks and building stuff, that's not wages that council has to pay contractors to do it. And, that's a direct benefit to council that the climbers are putting in there. And that's how we have to think. And unfortunately, it's quite hard to convince climbers are shoppers, and probably slackliners are the same. We're pretty individualists and not great at working as a team and doing that kind of stuff. But I think everyone should think they need to do a day or so work a year. It's only a day or so a year of that kind of stuff that's outside. It's not fixing your place to make your activity better. It's like, how can I make the place I'm at, the whole region I'm at, a better place for everyone? And I think you'll get a lot more respect from the land managers, and that could be the Aboriginal traditional owners or Parks Victoria or whoever it is. You'll get a lot more respect from them if that's how you're seeing us operating, adding benefit to the whole area. That's the only hope I see.
No, I think that's very sound advice.
Unfortunately, that will take an organisation to organise that activity. It's very hard to do it as a single individual, and that's where an ACA Australian thing or an ASA or whatever, and that's where those groups can hopefully talk with a land manager and say, hey, we've got labour, look at us, we're all like, young fit people, we can lift rocks all day long, we're willing to to help out here. Is there something you need done? Do you need just to chop some weeds out? Do you need us to move this? Whatever you need to do.
So that'd be helpful to the land manager, I guess, based on what you were saying before, how they're under-resourced. That would actually be genuinely helpful.
Absolutely, yeah, and even other things, being joining an SES or whatever it is, and being involved in that sort of search and rescue stuff. They're always looking for people, lost bushwalkers. They're always looking for people stumbling around in the bush. More hands make light work for them. Yeah, so it's that offering of how to reduce their load. And we try and do the opposite, because most of these land managers will look at a recreational activity as something that they have to manage. That's more work for them. It's like, oh, God, like if we let you in here, then we're going to have to go and make sure you guys are doing the right thing. And, that's extra work. That's extra dollars on the end of the budget at the end of the year. We're allocating $500,000 to managing slacklining, and that's what some politician up the chain is just seeing. Oh God, that cost us, $1 million in rescues this year for rock climbing accidents. So how do we make that feel like it's a positive equation for them more than a negative equation?
So if the Craighead days have been a successful example, I guess, of giving to the land, giving to the community, giving to the land manager, and I guess making ourselves part of the fabric, hopefully, that are there any examples we've seen of successes working with Aboriginal traditional owners? I mean, I guess we haven't. There hasn't been a situation where they've owned too many bits that we wanted to climb on, and or been given the ownership of them by Parks, say. And then also they're coming from a position of, well, there was all these studies done in the 90s or 70s, you said, that found the artwork, but really there wasn't much done to preserve them, apart from hide them, I guess. So they're coming from a position of, well, hang on, all of a sudden everyone cares a bit more. What is there any successes there, I guess, or that we've seen, or we're still learning what they how best to build that relationship? What they actually
want out of this land, and not, as I'm not sure. I can't speak for them, that's for sure. All we can offer is this sort of sense of we can look after land, like Rapparees, for example. There's a lot of climbers are doing weeding there. That's a big thing that they do there, is just removing invasive weeds from that area. Climbers are building tracks there, which are multi-use tracks for walkers and climbers. Mostly climbers. What can we bring to that? I'm not actually sure, honestly. If there's any kind of economic benefits for them, quite a lot of those the Aboriginal corporations, that's sort of generally the basis for their existence, is they are supposed to be giving economic benefit to their people. That's the reasons for the existence of these corporations generally. Be getting government funding or businesses that run under these things. I'm not 100% sure how climbing could be directly beneficial to that. But again, try not to make more work for them or make it problematic for them, I guess. I'm not an expert, unfortunately, in that.
I'm hoping to do an episode with a ranger, if I can find one that wants to talk to us to understand what land managers think. And I'm hoping to do an episode around Aboriginal cultural heritage as well, so we can get a better understanding of that.
It's been very difficult to get any direct Aboriginal people from the Grampians or Rapparees to have any direct interactions with the climbing community. There's been some little bits and pieces, the Millennium Cave debolting apparently reasonably successful. In that they saw the climbers were involved in removing anchors from an art site, and so they, appreciated that the climbers were cleaning up the area. It's probably not a direct benefit to them necessarily, because it's sort of cleaning up the climbing stuff anyway. I don't know. I just think, look, we need to look a bit more outside of what a climbers bring to communities. I think that climbers bring skills well outside climbing or slacklining to these communities. There's so many medical people, for example, live in regional Australia, and they live in these areas because of being close to climbing. And that has actually brought this skill set to the community that would have been very hard to get. A doctor, for example, in regional Australia is very hard to get. But if you have a pursuit as a recreation that doctor loves doing, that's one of the great benefits of a lot of these recreational things. And it comes from, mountain biking, all these sort of recreational outdoor sports. There's actually a pretty decent crossover between those activities and well-educated. A lot of people have come from university backgrounds. There's a bit of a crossover in needed skills for these regional areas, and I think that's a benefit that's sometimes not factored into something like a climbing closure. Parks Victoria, they don't care. It's not their prerogative to know what doctors are in Horsham Hospital and who's doing what where. But that's the kind of impacts that a closure could actually have in a region, is losing skilled people, skilled workers. They might be local carpenter. They might be, any sort of job that are one of these recreation. That's why they live in these areas. They're not appealing to someone who doesn't really like hanging out in the bush. There's an amazing sort of change in regard I'm even seeing regionally around here in places like Lithgow and stuff where, coal mining's out and, recreational tourism, outdoor tourism is the thing that they're hoping for, is the future. So there's a whole new bunch of people coming through to live in Lithgow that would have never lived there 20 years ago. It's just slowly changing the area. And that's because of access to these recreational areas. And you close it all off, those people are not interested in coming here, and you lose them all. I think of half the medicos in Blackheath, where I live here, the dentists and the doctors and the physios and all those people, they're all climbers. You go climbing with them, that's the local GP, that's the local physio, that's the local dentist. They literally have all the jobs here.
All right. Well, any further questions, Chris, before we wrap up this mammoth episode? I've certainly learned a lot. Haven't talked much, which is good. I haven't really had to ask many questions. We've just flowed nicely
I could just
through.
keep talking forever and ever.
Many topics.
But
maybe that's what I did well. I got someone that was a good talker on the podcast. I'll claim that.
Yeah. I haven't even referred to my notes. I haven't even referred to the notes I wrote.
No, I think Neil's hit the nail on the head repeatedly throughout this episode as well. Yeah, we do have to think of parks these sort of spaces and land managers in more of a lens than just how we normally view them when we go out and do our activities. There are economic lenses to look at this through. There are, this sort of corporation sort of, I guess, like it's a much more nuanced and involved sort of world beyond, the trees and the rocks that we actually feel and experience out there. And I think if anyone takes anything away from this podcast or the podcast series, is exactly that, is that our access shouldn't be taken for granted, and we need to think about lots and lots of things when we want to go out and just have fun and not think about anything.
Yeah, unfortunately, yes, that's a perfect takeaway. Yes, it's very easy for us to just go out and do our thing, but there's all sorts of other people that are looking at the same piece of land we are, with all sorts of other objectives that we may be totally clueless to what they want, and we may not be directly compatible with them.
Yeah. I mean, I was clueless to highlining at a lookout might concern the land manager because someone wants to jump over the edge of the lookout and come stand next to you.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, wow, yeah, that's a problem. That cuts out a lot of highlines because a lot of highlines are going next to lookouts.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I mean, this is just a real quick thing. Sorry, you're probably gonna have to edit this one out, but we had a highline down in Tassie that over the what's it called? It's like one of the most southern points out down on the peninsula there. Over the chasm or something, I think it's called. And yeah, so James Short established a highline there years ago, and then it came back the next year, and they built the trail all the way to the very anchor, and then the lookout right next to the bolts at the anchor. It looks like he's just gone in and bolted right at the lookout. But actually,
I was here first.
was,
Yeah.
20 kilometres back at this point, or maybe not that far, but it was like 5 or 6 kilometres away. And then in the last year, they just built the stairs all the way towards it, but the handrails right at the bolts, and it was like, oh, no, what have you done? So, we have a compatibility issue mostly where highlining and beautiful places and these beautiful lookouts there. We all want to be in the same area.
Yeah, we got feedback on a permit we submitted that it affected the visual amenity of the area, and I can partially understand that. Someone comes to the lookout, they want to take the Instagram photo the same as everyone else, and there's 4 blooming highlines cutting across the gorge,
Yeah. Yes, infrastructure. They always get scared of infrastructure. So, yeah, I mean, that was the other takeaway this ranger said to me. It's like when you guys install rock climbing bolts in the Grampians, it's like some random guy pulling up in his 4-wheel drive in the car park, taking out a swing set, installing the swing set in the car park, pushing his kid on the swing set for 10 minutes, and then just driving off and going back to Queensland. And just leaving the swing set, and then we have to manage it. Like, it's like, yeah, good point. Like, that's how we kind of treat these things. We do just kind of install infrastructure kind of randomly and then just sort of drive away and leave it there. I'm like, yeah, I don't quite do swing sets, but I see his point. Like, it was a really good point. It's always made me think, oh, yeah. That's how they see it.
It's tough, I reckon. Like, as a city dweller now, I mean, I grew up on a farm, so at least I had a bit of land I could go do something I wanted on. Like, I could do a wheelie in my car, and had freedom, right? But now I'm in the city. National parks are kind of like freedom to me because I can go there and I kind of feel like I can do anything I want within reason. But recent events, I guess, are a reminder that even if we pay our taxes, that area may not be accessible to us either.
Yeah. It's the death of public land when you have. I mean, I always thought that public land was kind of this universally owned kind of piece of land, and I was kind of like proud of like our national parks and the public land, but I'm beginning to realise that's not how some parts of the bureaucracy thinks about public land, and even particular sides of the political spectrum are more now about giving that land back to traditional owners, and for it no longer to be public land. And my own slight sadness is that I feel like it's a loss to the overall community. It always felt like that piece of public land was something that we all together. It was part of being part of a democracy, is that you had this piece of land that was a shared piece of land, and I think it would be a loss to the community if we lost all national parks and they became not places that you or I could work at. For example, I like to think that any one of us three could be a ranger, and decide that we love this piece of land so much that we went and got ourselves a science degree and became a ranger and spent our life looking after XYZ national park. But I actually don't think that's where our trajectory is necessarily going in Australia, which makes me
what
a little
makes
bit
you think
sad.
that? Like, what makes the science?
When the land is taken from being public and handed over to an Aboriginal corporation, effectively that family group would manage that land, and that's how it's going to work. I mean, it is already working like that in many national parks in Australia. I mean, I can think of one immediately in New South Wales, Murrumbidgee National Park. That's how it's managed. It's a different way of managing it, and that's how New South Wales National Parks' trajectory is. I mean, they have published a document a couple of years ago saying their aim is for all national parks in Australia to be run under the same system that Murruwinji National Park is, in this what's called joint ownership, joint management system. So yeah, it's a different way of public land being managed. So it's sort of much more about seeking permission to be on this land when you want to visit it, than this sort of feeling of a right to access that public land. It's interesting, yeah.
Yeah,
sort of
for fear of saying the wrong thing, but I'll say it anyway. But that it sort of seems like it's one of the easiest sort of solutions to reconciliation is to hand back public lands. You know, it doesn't cost any money. You know, it doesn't really affect any of the politicians directly. It doesn't really affect most of the people in the city directly. And we're sort of caught in the crossfire of, you know,
absolutely,
the solution that is, you know, the majority of people seem to agree with, and yet, you know, as an avid outdoor user that uses these places all the time, we're sort of, you know, disproportionately affected by it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's that kind of land, the changing of land management in big scale, which we haven't really touched on in this, is you know, it's politics. It really is. It's a political statement. It's driven by a particular side of politics, which, look, I agreed with in that, you know, in generally that side of politics for many years, but this has kind of slightly made me, you know, a bit grumpy. But that's just, and as Chris said, it's the easiest kind of land for them to do this too, and then they can publish. I mean, you'll see the Queensland government has done it on what was the climbing area that was recently changed? Minto, yeah, you'll see the Queensland government will publish a press release, and they'll say, you know, literally the amount of land that they've handed back that year. You know, we'll say we've done, you know, 20,000 kilometres of land. Like literally, that's part of the press release. The statistics to sort of wow you with this statement of look how much we're doing here. Look how much land we're landing back. Yeah, it makes me kind of feel fairly pessimistic about the whole process. You realise how much it's manipulated as a political advantage. You know, it's an election thing. You need to do this just before an election, so you get a certain amount of votes.
Handing back a coal mine or a big farming lease or something without too much kickback from the lobbyists.
No, and funnily enough, the most land most susceptible to these issues is the land that, you know, for rock climbers, it was always the Crown land or state forest was always the ones that I was like, yeah, we can do whatever we want in this land because it's not a proper national park. It's like, but that's actually the ones that are really, really easy to be handed over. National parks, by definition, the joint management, they'll still have to be a national park. They can't just be shut off. They have to be a national park. There can be restrictions on access to areas, but they still have to be a national park. But Crown land and some state forests can very easily, with a stroke of a pen by a politician with no requirement for public consultation, can be handed as freehold land to.
That's what happened with Minto,
an Aboriginal corporation.
Unallocated state
Absolutely.
land.
So it can just be easily. I mean, there's a section around in Point Perpendicular that it changed a couple of years ago that I only just became aware of. I was down there climbing, and I was like, "This is a weird piece of land, and what's the deal with this?" And I googled it, and I was like, "Oh, this has literally been handed to its freehold land. It's been handed to this Aboriginal corporation in the last 2 years." Post-COVID, they haven't really done anything with it yet. There's no sort of signs up saying private property or anything, but it's as freehold land as land that you or I might own that a house is on. That's what it is now. So that kind of land is being handed over, and that's sort of these sort of pretty weird areas. Quite often, and unfortunately, cliffs are one of these targets for these lands because cliffs historically, in a agricultural sense, are really useless bits of land. So, you know, when people were drawing up the maps of Australia, you know, colonial era, they were going, "Oh, this is a great sheep property, this is a great housing estate, but what's this piece of crappy, you know, cliff that's in the way? Well, that'll just be some Crown land," and they just, you know, it's just been this piece of land sitting there that's, you know, technically useless, you know, for economic purposes historically, and these are the bits of land that both of our user groups are obviously find very appealing. Areas with, no one there, cliffs, exploration, no development. That's sort of our thing. But that's the easy one to be handed over. So we can certainly expect more of that stuff. So it's very important that your organisation really researches who owns the land on these areas you're doing it very closely, and if it's flagged as Crown land, be particularly cautious about what the future of that land is, and be aware. And just like Chris was talking about, these plans of management, when they come up for a review, Crown land being passed on to someone, and I'm not saying that doesn't have to go to an Aboriginal corporation, it could go to anyone who puts up their hand and gives a great reason for why they need it. And, it is 100% possible that land could be given to a slacklining organisation. Like, there is no reason that it's absolutely possible. In fact, the Minto Crags climbing debacle from a few years ago, it was 100%, that they were talking, but the government was totally talking with the ACAQ about them taking charge of this land, taking ownership of the land, and they decided it was too hard. And then other things happened there. But it's really important that we keep an eye on what's happening, and it won't be easily found. We have to dig around and check what that land is. There's heaps of places in the Blue Mountains, really popular climbing areas that are either on private land that no one realises that are on private land, or on Crown land that is just unallocated land, that is just weird little plots of land. The council websites are really great at telling you the land the land boundaries and who has the land. Most councils have really great mapping that you can zoom around and see all the borders and check their environmental zones and all that sort of stuff. Definitely worth checking on your favourite area to make sure it is what you think it is, because quite often people are like, oh, that's definitely national park, and you're like, no, it's not. Maybe the approach was, but the actual cliff itself is something else. Yeah,
there's a site, Queensland Globe, that has good stuff for Queensland, like whether it's a parcel or it's private. And then if you want to find the owner of the private, you got to pay for the title search. And
and Tassie's got the list. It's a very expensive mapping tool.
Yeah.
Well, all the state governments have privatised this land title search and businesses. That's all the whole thing. I know New South Wales did it a few years ago. It's just like, oh yeah, it's something you can privatise. That's not great. So I'm not surprised they all cost money now.
Yeah, from a trend point of view, you're sort of saying the trend is to hand back some of that land. So I guess if we're being smart about the strategy for ASA, we're looking at what the trend is from the land manager and going, well, how do we make sure we're aware of that trend? And
creating a positive impression in general, because you might have new owners in a few years' time. Might be 10 years' time, might be 20 years' time, but there's a good chance that that the land will not be managed in the way it's managed now in the future. That's for sure. So it's already changing in quite a bit of Australia. So yeah.
I like the idea of being part of the fabric. So even if the new owners come in and they let bushwalkers in, but they're thinking about not letting highliners in. Well, if the highliners and the slackliners are a strong part of the community, they're part of the rescue teams, they're part of the crag care environmental things, it sort of makes them a bit harder to kick out, because hopefully the other user groups will stick up for us. The bushwalkers will be like, well, hang on, these guys are part of the team,
I mean, you're obviously, your ideal situation is to have a whole bunch of people who belong to the Aboriginal corporation who love slacklining as well. That's your ideal situation. I mean, to have it as an accepted activity across everyone, to demystify that it's something that would be offensive. I mean, unfortunately, climbing has been dragged into this kind of image where somehow the action of climbing itself, not the installation of bolts or anything like that, but just the action of climbing is for some reason an offensive activity, and how that's occurred is yet to be deciphered, really. But that's sort of the narrative that gets handed around, is that the action of climbing is somehow offensive, and you hope that we can try and demystify that, and make the sport or the activity something that is appealing for everyone.
I mean, Minto, the heading was sacred rock climb, saved saved from the climbers or something. But I mean, I think of forward driving, and I forward drive to go surfing and highline or whatever. And I mean, it's high impact than climbing. Like there's a lot of forward driving around, and that's definitely a lot higher impact than any climbing or highlining. But it's more accepted, I guess.
Yeah, totally. It's just a sort of generally accepted by the community, and some of this is just demystifying it, isn't it? Like, there's some things. I mean, climbing can have positive things. Even, Alex Honnold's, whatever it was, free solo a few years ago, probably actually, even though it makes climbing look really crazy and dangerous, in some ways it did demystify it to a lot of people, I think. It's made it an acceptable thing. I mean, that's an example of like something that actually is incredibly risky and dangerous, but Free Solo, the movie, didn't make all the land managers turn around the next day and ban climbing around Australia. I think it actually might have even helped.
This conversation's made me realise that maybe the safety aspect's not as important as I thought. Like, there's all these other things that I thought safety was number one, but now after this conversation, I was completely wrong about that.
Yeah, no, not at all. If you're making work for land managers, that's your biggest issue. If you're making problems for them, that's your big issue. Safety, I think, would be right down. It'd be number 10 down the list, I reckon. When I think about climbing, no land manager would know the difference between someone leading a trad route and a sport route, and that one's more dangerous than this, and bouldering. They just see it all as people on rocks climbing, and
I think off the record, I reckon jumping probably had a pretty legitimate shot around the world at being legal if they didn't have such a sort of punk rock attitude to it all, and they did actually sort of go down the more legal path, instead of jumping buildings and just putting up the middle.
That's half the appeal, though, isn't it?
Exactly.
That's base jumping's appeal.
Exactly, but it's skateboarding sort of went that path, and it's sort of one of the few sports that have managed to successfully sort of come out the other side of it, but probably only because of the sheer volume of people that and the accessibility of the sport. But all of our activities sort of have this sort of level of money you have to spend to sort of get into it, and so we're never quite going to have the same scale of skateboarding just coming in and just being like, you have to accept us. There's no way you can ignore us, so we have to go down the path of working with them as opposed to against them.
Yeah, the financial barrier of our activities is actually a really big one. Quite often unappreciated by users who have probably been brought up in middle class Australia, like we probably all have. It's our sports. It seems like the equipment's not that expensive, but we also all own vehicles that can get us into the outdoors reliably, and we can afford to take the time off to do these activities. It's a very very middle class pursuit, really. We shouldn't expect that everyone can be able to do it.
Yeah, I guess for a period of time, my cars I owned would definitely worth less than my highlining gear.
Yeah.
I just bought an almost new car, and I would still say the same thing. I think I've got to run, guys, because I've got an early start tomorrow.
I think we're done. I don't know how it was finished. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Neil. Thanks, Chris. Absolute pleasure. And thanks for sticking so long and giving so much good information to us and the listeners.
Cool. I'm not sure. Maybe I can't remember what Chris said. A few things there. This is off the record, but I think everything I've said is pretty on the record. I kind of, when I dabbled into the Aboriginal handback stuff, I'm like, people always take this out of context and all like that. That's my opinion, and that's the story.